Hey guys, Eli Montague here from the WTBA. Today what I'm going to talk to you about is protective gear for use in your self-defense based martial art, to pressure test your techniques while you're training to make sure that you can actually pull them off under pressure. This will be a series of videos. I'm not sure how many volumes, but basically in each episode, I'm going to talk about each individual piece of equipment. So boxing gloves, MMA gloves, groin guards, mouth guards, shin guards, chest protection, headgear, all the different type of gear that can be useful in pressure testing your self-defense art. So in this first video, I'm just giving you a general overview of whether or not you need any of this stuff, and generally how we go about using the gear in comparison to how a competitive martial art may use the same gear. There are far more similarities than there are differences between a competitive style martial art and a self-defense style martial art, but there are still some important differences to note. So I'll just give a couple of obvious examples, difference between competition and self-defense. In a competitive art, you train to use your fists 100% of the time because you're wearing the gloves when you fight, whether that be MMA gloves or boxing gloves. Whereas in a self-defense based art, we tend to use the palms a lot more than the fists. We occasionally use the fists, but the palm is the safer option when you don't have protection on your hands. I've even spoken to world champion boxers who will attest to that as well. No, I would never use fists in a street fight. Another thing would be the use of the fingers, eye strikes, finger strikes to the neck, things like that. So how can we use, for example, boxing gloves or even MMA gloves if they force us to always use fists in our training? Well, that will be the detail I'll go into when we get onto the categories of the gloves within the series. One other major difference between competitive style training compared to self-defense is role-playing. When you do competitive style training, you're both trying to do the same thing. You both have the same skill sets, and more or less, and you both want the same outcome, again, more or less. So I'm going to use wrestling, jiu-jitsu, grappling, any of that kind of stuff as an example here. It still applies to everything else, striking based as well, but this is the most obvious example. In a street fight, I do not want to be on the ground at any point. That's the worst place I can be. So I don't want to practice doing takedowns because I don't want to be down there. But I do want to learn how to defend against takedowns. So instead of us both standing up doing stand-up grappling and both trying to take each other down, it's my job to try to stay on my feet and hit him and do whatever, but it's his job to try to take me down. So it's a role play. He's the attacker, I'm the defender. Same goes once you end up on the floor. My job is to get back to my feet as quickly as possible. Sure, I need to know how to wrestle down there. I can't just stand back up. I still need to learn grappling methods in order to get back to my feet if he's pinning me down or something. But my goal is not to apply a submission hold. My goal is to get him off me and get back to my feet. And in fact, jiu-jitsu actually does that same thing. If it's a self-defense jiu-jitsu class versus a competitive jiu-jitsu class. So I've noticed that a lot. I've been to some jiu-jitsu classes. I went to one, a really good one actually, down in my local town. And I was going there for a couple of months, twice a week, just to try out something different, see what they were doing, see what they were up to. And I found it really interesting, really eye-opening. But the main thing that I really noticed was at the end of the class, for about the last 20 to 30 minutes of each class, we would free wrestle. And that was fantastic because I didn't have to learn set techniques that I wasn't used to. I could just do what I already know how to do, but play with other people and spar with them effectively. But what I found is, if I was working with someone who was not of a very high level, especially if they weren't as big as me, well then I would play the part of the attacker for their benefit. I would put them into an armbar or a sleeper hold or something. I'd do something so that they could learn how to get out of that situation. Whereas if I was sparring with someone much bigger than myself, and especially if they were very good at the jiu-jitsu, so a higher level of skill on a grappling level than myself, anytime I would try, I tested this out many times, if I would attempt to apply any type of submission hold, that would open me up and they would then put me in one. So I'd try to go for something and that would open me up and they would get me in a hold. But if I treated it as a self-defense situation, right, my goal is don't let them get me into a submission hold. And they might still eventually get me in one because they're very good at what they do, but I would last like 10 times longer. I was always able to last a long time at least, comparatively to if I tried to do the submission hold. So that's my point. That, therefore, is role-playing. He didn't know it. I didn't tell him I was doing role-playing. I just decided myself, right, I'm not going to try to put him in a hold. All I'm going to try to do is get him off me. I wasn't fully standing back up onto my feet and then, simulating a kick or something, because we're doing classical jiu-jitsu in that class. So I was being respectful of their class. But what I would do is I would get myself to the point where, let's say someone had, I don't know, they were on top of me, pinned me down. I'd grab his leg, I'd bridge, I'd flip him over, sort of go like, up, like could have got up in that moment, and then I'll go back into it. So as long as I got myself into a position where I felt like I could have in that moment stood back up, that was what made me able to stay the most in control. But if I had been trying the whole time to do a submission hold, then chances are, again, reflex. Like I was saying with everything else. If you get into a street fight where you get knocked to the floor, your natural reaction is, oh, lock him, armbar, do this, stay on the floor. No, you want your reflex to be get up as quickly as possible. So pretty much all the protective gear that you may want to use to pressure test, whether it be groin guards or shin pads or mouth guards, chest guards, headgear, anything you want to use, it's not going to change the way you move. Sure, it might be a little bit bulkier or something, but ultimately anything you do within your system of self-defense, my systems being Taiji Chuan and Baguazhang, but generally self-defense is self-defense. There's only so many things that you can do. So none of these things will restrict what you can practice, except for gloves. Gloves will restrict what your hands can achieve. So, as I say, I will talk about that in detail as to how to use gloves in order to pressure test what you're doing, but without changing your subconscious reflexive muscle memory into always using fists. You see, how you train is how you will fight. You're programming your body to do a certain thing. In a real fight, your body reacts. I'm not talking about a control situation. If you're in a control situation, if some young boy came up to me and he was showing off in front of his friends, for example, my subconscious reflex action of punch him in the throat or gouge his eyes out is not going to come into play because my body is not feeling threatened. It's not reacting to anything. It's fighting from a thought process of, I'm just going to control this child. But it's when you get attacked, especially suddenly, which is how most street fights happen. You don't square up before a street fight. Street fights just happen without thought. So whatever is in your muscle memory, the thing that you practice the most, is most likely to come out. So if you practice with gloves on, 90 or 100% of the time, it's highly unlikely you're going to instinctively react by hitting someone with your palm. Even if you think to yourself, oh, if I got in a street fight, I'll use my hand. Yes, that may work if it's not a serious environment and it's not reflexive. It's not in the moment. But if that happens like that, you will probably revert to what your body knows because it's your muscle memory taking over, not your conscious brain. And if your muscle memory says hit with the fist, because of all the training you've done with the gloves on, you'll probably hit with the fist. And I guess I don't need to tell you that it's much more likely to break your hand in a street fight if you use fists comparatively to palms. Please don't take anything I'm saying as being in any way negative, by the way, against boxing or MMA or Muay Thai or any of those. I have a lot of respect for those arts. I think they're brilliant. And I'm by no means saying that a boxer can't defend himself in a street fight. I'm just saying that there are certain ways that we can train that will help us a little better in a street fight by using, as an example, the palm instead of the fist. That's very funny, Clara. Do you want to show the camera? Clara would like to show you her little nose decoration. Come on, Clara. Come here. Watch the cord. You got Play-Doh on your nose, don't you, Clara? Mwah. So the main thing I want to talk about in this introduction is whether we need it or not. Do you really need to use any or all of this gear in order to properly practice self-defense? The short answer, absolutely yes, in my opinion. Not everything that we'll be talking about. You don't need to have every single piece of equipment. I think Clara's singing now. But certain bits of it. And as we go through the series, again, I'll explain which ones are necessity and which ones are optional. Okay, let's talk about realism to start with. The more realistic you can make your training, the better, right? So the closer to a real fight that it can be, the better it's going to be for your training. So is it closer to a real fight to use protection? Or is it closer to a real fight to not use protection? So the obvious answer to that is wearing nothing, fighting and training how you would walk down the street is the most realistic. But that only applies if you're comparing protective gear versus no protective gear, but you're fighting and training at the exact same pressure levels. What tends to happen with 99% of clubs who practice self-defense, whatever the style, if they're not using protective gear, it means they're not contacting. They're never actually connecting with any of their punches, which means what? They're throwing their punches, but they're pulling their punches. Now this can work to a degree, but you cannot throw a fully realistic punch, even at a slower pace, if you have that mental notion of control. You know that when you're doing that drill, if your partner gets it wrong, you've got to not, just a little tap or something is fine, but you've got to make sure you don't follow through with all that power. So you're holding back. That's not realistic if you're holding back. By putting on the gloves, or whatever stuff we're going to talk about, you're now not holding back. And what I mean by holding back, you may not necessarily want to train full contact. So when your partner throws his punches at you, you may not want him to hit you full force, because even with a glove on, he could still knock you out with that punch. So you have to agree with your partner as to what pressure you're going to train at. But the thing is, without the glove on, you can only go up to a very, very mild, almost just touch pressure. Whereas with the glove on, you can go a hell of a lot more pressure with still doing very minimal damage to your body, or pretty much no damage to your body. You see, when you're pulling your punches, you might think to yourself like, okay, just a simple example. Say someone throws like a round punch of some kind, and you do whatever blocky thing you do to stop yourself from getting hit from that. You might think it's working really well. But if they have that held back attitude to their punch, it means that their punch is really aiming here. The point at which they're putting that apex, the target in their mind is before for your head. They're thinking hit hard, but only to there, not to there. So what happens is, you think you're stopping it. And I've tested this so many times, you then put a glove on and say, right, now actually hit me in the face. And you'll find a lot of the time it will come through. It's especially important for beginners. Now you can train without the gloves on if you're a very seasoned expert, a really good instructor, a teacher, for example, and you've got super good control. So you can maybe throw a pretty close to realistic punch. It's still not 100% realistic, but at least it's 90% of the way there. So that's pretty good anyway. So if you happen to be working with a really good instructor and you're working one-on-one with that person, maybe it's okay that they're not wearing the gloves, because it's still pretty realistic. But if you have two beginners in a class working together, those beginners don't have that kind of control. So either someone's going to get really hurt because they do swing through, or they're going to be pulling their punches so much that they're not learning anything. Put a couple of gloves on them and they relax straight away. I've done it so many times with students where I'll say, punch me. And I'll literally tell, if it's a smaller person or something, I'll say, look, just hit me on the jaw. Not too hard, just give me a good punch. And they'll be like, they don't really want to do it because they're scared of hurting me because they're not used to hitting stuff. Put a glove on them, oh great, whoop, and they swing their fist through at me because they're now relaxed. They don't have that conscious setting that, oh, I don't want to hurt him though while we're training, which most beginners have. So in fact, by wearing boxing gloves or protective gear in general, you're actually allowing the students to be far more relaxed in what they're doing. They're less likely to stiffen up in their techniques because they don't have to worry about it so much. They can throw the punch and not be worried about hurting the other person. So essentially, when you hear people say that you shouldn't use protective gear because it makes it unrealistic, if that person actually trains fighting without protective gear and they properly hit each other in their training without protective gear, well, okay, he has the right to say that. But if someone who teaches self-defense, who is doing it in a sense where they're just pulling their punches so no one gets hurt, then in my opinion, they're doing a far less realistic thing than me wearing gloves while I'm training. So let's talk a little bit about risk factor versus your skill level. They're directly related. If you want zero risk, you're going to have zero skill, pretty much. Or no, let's say, I don't know, you might get 10 or 20% something. If you just learn, for example, just learning how to hit using pads, that'll give you some extra chance in a fight, just knowing you can hit well. So there's no risk in learning how to hit. And then doing a couple of basic little blocking drills where there's no real pressure, it'll help you out to some degree in a real fight. Practicing grappling stuff. Now it's quite easy to practice grappling stuff with very little risk, so long as you've got mats on the floor. But when it comes to striking, someone trying to knock your head off with a fist or an elbow or kicking you or something like that, anything striking based, this is where the risk has to go up to some degree in order for your skill to go up. If you want zero risk, you're never going to get that far on your fighting training. So an MMA fighter, you know, a UFC champion, they fight, they train with the highest level of risk, okay? Because they actually fight. Sure, it's not a street fight. There are some rules and so on, but there's not that many rules. People can still be killed or paralyzed or have serious lifelong injuries from competing in the UFC tournaments. So apart from actually fighting full on with no rules and you're going to gouge each other's eyes out and rip each other's testicles off or something, there's nothing more risky as far as how someone trains than MMA. Now, they don't train like that all the time. When they're doing their general sparring, they're doing it light. Most MMA players, to my knowledge, and boxers and kickboxers and so on, they train light contact most of the time to work on their skill and that kind of thing, their technique. But then they actually fight, don't they? So they actually get in the ring and try to knock each other out. Therefore, their pressure test level is the highest. Therefore, their risk level is the highest. Therefore, also their skill level is the highest. Now, in theory, you could take any martial art. I could take Tai Chi, and we could train it to that same level of pressure and risk. But we choose not to. The chances of you getting into a fight, a life or death situation fight, is very unlikely unless you live in a really, really dangerous sort of a place. But even then, those really dangerous places, usually you're talking about guns and knives and gangs anyway, in which case your martial art's not going to help you that much anyway. But generally speaking, for the average person, it's not that likely to get into a serious situation. But of course, I still want to practice martial arts and self-defense just in case, even if there's only a tiny % chance that that might happen. I want to know that I can protect myself and my family, especially now I have 2 little girls. But the chances of that person who might try to attack me and my family in the street being a world champion UFC fighter, that's pretty much nothing. Because a world champion UFC, the type of commitment and time it would take to get to that level is so much that hopefully that sort of a person isn't the type of person to want to come and mug you. So yeah, if you want to be 100% safe and you want to be the toughest guy out there in the street, well, you're going to have to train at that level of brutality, in which case you're risking your own health. I don't want to have brain damage by the time I'm 50. I want to still be able to play with my little girls. So I see it as I'm putting myself and therefore my family at more risk by training the martial art at that full pressure level compared to the possibility of getting attacked by someone of that full professional level in the street. So the way that I see learning martial arts for street self-defense, for protection, is to get it to the point where you can more or less defend yourself against any average guy out there, even an average guy who's not that well trained, who's a lot bigger than you, or 3 guys who aren't that well trained, because 90% of the time it's going to be people who aren't that well trained. So in the WTBA, and as far as I've seen, most self-defense based systems, we train to a proficiency level of, let's say 70% proficiency, just a random number, but roughly, like, we're not going to ever be that 100% like a world champion fighter, but we're okay with being here. Because, you see, let's say this is risk and this is skill. Your skill level goes up, right, to 70%. But see how my risk level only went up just a tiny little bit? But then to go from 70% to 100%, that's when that last percentage, that last 30%, your risk level really takes a big jump, okay? So you can get to a pretty good level of self-defense with little to no risk to your own health. But if you want to be the toughest guy in the street, now you've got to risk your own health every time you train. A lot of people out there don't think that my father advocated the use. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Eli Montague. I think I said that at the start. So my father was Earl Montague, so he was the head of our system until he died. Anyway, a lot of people don't think that he advocated the use of protection gear, because on most of his videos and in all his workshops, he never used it. We did like what I'm saying. We basically be careful and pull the punches. But that's because 90% of the people who have done some training with him have just come to a workshop. If you're teaching a workshop, all those students coming, there might be 100 people at the workshop. They don't all have the correct protective gear. And you as an instructor certainly can't bring enough stuff for hundreds or 100 people to practice with. So you end up doing just technique work. You know, you're not actually fighting. Typically in a workshop environment, you're not doing anything that rough because you don't know those people. If I do a workshop, I'm not going to do anything too rough. I'll only do rough stuff with the people who train with me on a regular basis. So I know those people, I know what their skill levels are, and I know how much pressure they should be using. So my father, for probably about the last, I don't know, maybe the last at least 15 years, maybe even 20 years of his life, he didn't run normal regular classes. Like he didn't have his own club as in a location. Okay, so the WTBA, for those who don't know, is an international organization. We have clubs all over the world. But my father, you know, in his later years, he was semi-retired from teaching. So the only people who got to do really rough training with my father were the people who trained with him back in the 80s, even the 70s, and, for example, myself and my brother, who trained with him at home on a daily basis. But anyone else who trained with him, let's say from around, I don't know, the mid-90s or so, something like that, onwards, they only trained with him in a sense that they did the drills, the practice methods, but they didn't actually fight with my father. Now, my dad would quite often say at a workshop or something, you know, blah, 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 talking about a technique, but you can put on protective gear to test this stuff properly. He would say that. And especially a lot of his very old videos, the videos that he filmed back in the 80s, you'll see him on camera wearing all the protective gear, things like these kind of things. He was a big fan of these kind of facial protections, you know, chest gear and all that kind of stuff. I did see him sometimes, I don't think he used gloves that often, but I did see him have some gloves there, so he obviously used them to some degree. But because he wasn't actually demonstrating it and doing it in workshops, the majority of the students, they'd just learn the drills, and then when they went home, they'd just learn those drills. They'd just keep practicing those drills. Of course, there would be a few that took his advice and went, right, okay, I'm going to buy some protective gear and actually, you know, take those drills that we learned at the workshop on the weekend. Now we're going to actually practice them now we're at home with, you know, with their training partners. So effectively, protective gear has always been a part of the WTBA to pressure test what we practice. It's just kind of been a little bit forgotten over the last couple of decades, at least with the majority of students. So that's my new thing that I'm doing, is I'm trying to re-promote it, bring us back to our roots and make sure that everyone who's wanting to practice the fighting area, some people just want to learn the form and the Qigong, but people who want to learn the fighting aspects, they have to get the gear that I recommend them for the things that we practice. Okay, so that'll do us for the intro. I hope that's given you some good ideas there, good reasoning as to getting some protective gear for whatever thing that you practice. In my personal opinion, if you're not using it, you might still be okay to a degree, but chances are you're going to get hit a lot more than you think you're going to get hit in a street fight. Using myself as an example, just to further this point that you need this stuff, over about the last 7 years, or from about 7 years ago, I met my wife, met my future wife, got married, traveled the world all over with her, had a baby, having another baby. My training took a step back, especially my martial training, because whilst we were traveling, I didn't really have anyone to practice with. That was one thing, but also I'd been practicing for so long on such an intensive level, I kind of felt like having a bit of a break. Anyway, when I got back into it on a more serious level, what I found was, first of all, we started doing drills and so on without gloves. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm still pretty damn good. You know, I don't feel like I've lost my skill. Then I said to my training partner, hey, I just want to make sure this is really working. Here, put these on. Just gave him a set of gloves, put those on. Now, we'll do the same thing, but I want you to really try to hit me. Don't pull your punches, really try to hit me. And the amount of times I got punched in the face was ridiculous because I was thinking I could stop all those punches because they weren't real punches. They were being pulled, okay? And like I said, maybe if the guy you're training with has a sublime skill of being able to throw a real punch and pull it, those people are very few and far between. But the average person you're training with, probably if they're not wearing gear, they're pulling their punches, making them unrealistic. So yeah, I found I was getting punched in the head all the time. But then because I guess I already had the training deep down within me, it was just a bit, it had been buried a little bit because I hadn't trained for a while. So after only a few weeks of getting back into the rough stuff, I found then I was stopping not all, but most of the strikes, even though he was really trying to swing the punches at me properly. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about full-sized, proper boxing gloves. And then the next episode after that, we'll be talking about MMA sparring gloves. Those are the two main things that I want to talk about. They need the most information, as I said, because of the fact that they restrict your movement the most. Everything else that I'll talk about, it'll just be a short lesson, but the gloves need a deeper discussion. So thank you for watching. Any questions, please let me know in the comments. Give us a like and give us a subscribe if you like our stuff. Good stuff, guys. Enjoy your training days, and I'll see you soon when we get back into the gloves.